Well, I'm here with Patri Friedman, who is the founder of Pronomos, a venture capital fund. He's also known for his work in starting the Seasteading Institute, which is a pioneering group dedicated to looking at creating sovereign, I guess we would say voluntarily funded and developed governances across the high seas. So thanks for joining me, Patri.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So, one of the things that I think is interesting is, it feels like we've gone through an eternity in some cases for the last few months during this pandemic. It's as if, people were saying it's nostalgic to look back at January or February of 2020
Yeah.
in terms of how much information overload, how much emotional overload people have experienced in the last time. First of all, how are you doing in this time? And how is your situation with those you know and your family?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. For me, I had the benefit of being in contact with some of the Silicon Valley tech folks who were shouting the alarm early. So I got my skepticism out of the way at the beginning of February and started kind of saying like, oh, what are you people worried about? This is going to be nothing. Because to me, it sounded like all these previous scares like Ebola and SARS and stuff that didn't really materialize. But you know, I had some conversations with people who knew a lot more than I did about biology and epidemiology, and they convinced me that I was wrong. And so I was able, my family was able to start preparing in February, and we moved about a year ago to a rural area in the mountains above the San Francisco Bay Area. And so we have our own water, we've got a propane tank, we've got our own septic, and so it was relatively easy for us to prepare by just by stocking up on supplies. And for me, I also, I got my doubt out of the way early, and I also got my like stress and freaking out. I'd say in February and March, I was I was paying a lot of attention to the news. I'm really stressed about it. I was drinking too much, which I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, and it wasn't good. But I got all that out of the way early. And for the last month or two, I've been in a much more accepting place, not paying attention to the news. Like we have our house set up, we have our supplies. And so what I've been doing, because I'm fortunate enough to have a job that can be done online, is I've just been focusing on my job and my family and myself, working on getting in shape, improving my nutrition, catching up on some much needed, coaching and therapy and stuff. And I found it a really wonderful time to bond with my family and kind of focus on getting strong for the post-pandemic world.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have had this as a time of, you know, going back to basics and figuring out what they can do to control the things they can control in their lives. What have you been finding to be helpful in your nutritional journey in this time that maybe that's helped your quality of life?
Well, it's really interesting because with the pandemic supplies situation, like I believe that eating a lot of fresh vegetables is really healthy, but that's not really an option right now. So,
Right.
for us, it's about a lot of frozen meat, and then some of those basic staple grains. We stocked up on lentils and beans and rice and wheat. So just like making use of spices in order to make things interesting, because we it's everybody's got months of spices, I think, in America in their closet. You don't run out.
Yeah.
And so just using spices instead of vegetables to keep things interesting, and yeah, focus on the basics like grains and meats and kind of fresh produce where we can. Planting gardens so that we're better prepared for if this should happen again.
Now you have a venture capital fund, and what are some of the things in your job that you guys are exploring? What is the particular interest or categories of interest that you guys investigate with your venture capital fund?
Yeah, so Pronomos is based on my 20-year interest in how we can upgrade our governments and make them work better. And the idea is to take a sort of Silicon Valley software perspective where rather than looking at government from the angles of kind of ethics or activism or who's getting elected, we instead look at it more like you would as a startup or an industry analyst, where we say, well, there's a small number of really big companies, and it's really hard for people to switch what country they live in, and there's no startups. People aren't making like the Apple or the Tesla of countries where they say, let's make a new place that's just so much better to live that people, eat the cost and come move here. And so of course it doesn't work very well, and it doesn't serve us when we can't innovate, we can't do startups, and we can't switch. So I originally worked on this through the Seasteading Institute, looking at how we could build new cities on the ocean. And that's very challenging from an engineering perspective. And one reason that we took that approach is it's a sort of a way of working around traditional governments and doing it without kind of support of governments. But lately, governments have become much more open to the idea of working with private companies to create zones, like special economic zones, where some of the laws and institutions are different. And so for them, it's a way to experiment with a change to their legal system in a small area that they're not really comfortable rolling out to the whole country yet, and seeing if it creates jobs and brings foreign investment. And so that's what we do at Pronomos. We work with these real estate projects that are doing not just a real estate development, but a real estate development that is a special economic zone. It's going to have different laws.
What are some of the areas geographically that you're targeting with this that have opened up promise?
So I see a lot of potential in Latin America and Africa. We do get interest from Europe, but I'm not sure whether you can do something meaningful inside the EU because it has so many anti-business laws. And then we get some interest from Asia and the Middle East, and the main challenge there is that those are the pros at building cities. Probably some of your listeners have seen the videos of China putting up a skyscraper in 30 days, or the hospitals they threw together for coronavirus. So in the Middle East and Asia, they build big, they build fast, and we're a small fund, and there's not really a way for us to fit into some $10 billion new city project. But we are working with a couple of smaller countries in Asia right now that I'm really excited about.
And so do you identify companies that want to relocate to those special economic zones, or you find companies that are already existing in those economic zones and then help them flourish in the free environment they're in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the basic economics of this is that, we're an investment fund. So we want to find people who are starting companies, doing this thing, creating these zones. And then it's the job of the people who start the companies to kind of make their zone succeed. So that includes working with the government. Like, we might provide the introduction and advice, but then the team needs to work with the government to create the legislation and pass the legislation and get approved, to get financing to build it, and to bring in tenants. I mean, that's a really important element, but that's more done by the founders of each project than by us. And then the basic kind of business model from a brass tacks perspective is, like other forms of real estate, if you can do this successfully, you can buy land that's cheap, that's empty, get it rezoned with different laws, and then bring in tenants who are attracted to those new laws, like you said, and make the land be worth more. And that's real estate. And you can capture kind of the economic activity you create either with taxes. For example, there's a project that launched just last week in Honduras, which has the most advanced program, and they're going to be collecting a 5% minimal paperwork flat tax, or you can capture it in land value and just the rent prices from making the land be worth more. But that's what it's fundamentally about, making land worth more.
So there's a focus on the land then. It's interesting.
Yeah, and it's real estate, but with a new value driver. Instead of location, it's more like, laws, or maybe like laws, institutions. So it's the land becomes worth more because, if you look at there's all these great indexes, the Doing Business Index or the Heritage Foundation, where they look at countries and they say, how many days does it take to get a license to be a small business? Or how much of the annual average salary does it cost in permits and bribes, right? And in Africa, it's like, in many countries, it's like 8 months of time and 8 months of income just to get the licenses to start a food stand. And, how can economic activity thrive in that kind of environment? It can't. And so we're working with countries, as I said, mostly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where the country says, okay, like we're not ready to change our whole system, or that might be too difficult, or maybe they don't want to change the rules on top of the existing population. That's something we very strongly support, doing this in empty areas, so that everybody who moves into this new system of rules has opted in. They've chosen it. So then people sometimes accuse these projects of going and taking over or imposing something on the locals. And we absolutely don't want to do that. I mean, someday if we're successful, maybe a region could vote to bring a new set of laws onto the region when it's already been proven and they know what they're getting. But right now it has to be on empty land.
What are some undervalued hotspots of economic liberty that people should know about? Maybe people should take a better look at.
I'd say this project in Honduras that launched last week is really, really exciting. So it's a prosperity zone that's part of this Honduran program where they changed their constitution to allow the government to create these new zones that have streamlined, business-friendly commercial law, while they still follow the constitution and criminal law of Honduras. And the first one just launched on the island of Roatan in the Caribbean. It's a beautiful tourist island, has one of the best reefs in the world. I went down in a submarine where we went down like 2,000 feet. It's actually, there's this guy who got in the news a bunch. He built a submarine in his backyard when he was like 16, like a really good submarine. And he's improved it over the years and built a new one. And he operates on this island of Roatan, where it's basically, there's a sheltered bay, and then just outside it, it drops 1,000 feet instantly, and then it slopes down another 1,000 feet. And so you can go in his submarine, and sometimes he sees life under the water that nobody's ever seen before, because so few people go down that deep. I mean, it's way below, normal scuba range. Anyway, it's an incredible island, and as soon as the coronavirus quarantine ends, they're going to start building their first office building, and they're taking deposits now for their first set of residences. It's pretty reasonably priced. I think the low end residences are 150,000 and they're going to rent them out. So you could buy this residence and live in it part of the year, go there on vacation, and rent it out the rest of the time. Other places people might not know about, I'd say some of my favorite countries are Liechtenstein, Taiwan, Singapore, and Estonia. These are all like small, really well-run countries. I talked to people from all of them, and in some of those countries, I've talked to their prime minister, and there's something about small, to get at some of your themes, David, of local governance, that the places that are small, where normal people in a country of 100,000 people or even 1 million people can get access sometimes to their leaders, it just works so much better. And I see so many of the problems of the United States are that government has gone to the federal level, and you can't keep in touch with 350 million constituents. Even, I live in California. It's a terribly run state. I think it's terribly run partly because it's so big. And that's why Tim Draper tried to get it broken down, but into multiple states, but there's just too much political resistance. So, these small countries they're just better businesses for their citizens.
You bring up a point there. There's a debate. I just had it with another individual on my radio program that, well, at the same time, is there a quirk or something in the population that desires power in a kind of vicious way, even at the local level? So do we run the risk of romanticizing the local to some degree when we think about the petty tyranny of, say, an HOA president that's trying to viciously destroy families over small little issues? It makes you wonder, it's not as bad as a unelected CIA overthrowing countries around the world, but it still brings out something that, even at the smallest minute level, like whether a trash can should be in the road or out in the garage, or whether the grass should be this high or this high, that there's some percentage of the human population that just has this almost robotic-like desire to sort, categorize, and eliminate at all times. It's kind of creepy. Is that something
Yeah.
we can actually transcend as a species, you know? And how
Yeah,
would we?
look, I would say there's two fronts for dealing with that. The first front is, suppose we just say that impulse is fixed and it's out there in all humans. Well, the smaller a scope we give it, the better. And so when somebody has that instinct for tyranny or for unilateral action, for holding people back, and they get to be in charge of some giant federal system or some giant military, much worse things happen than when it's just your HOA president. So the first thing I would say is that's a reason for local action, because it's not like when you have those kinds of personalities at the highest level, they still do awful things. It's not like it's safe there. And then the second avenue of attack, I think, is better laws, better HOA rule sets, better systems of governance, so that people can, can say this is not working for me, or this is not my leader. If you look at what's happening in the cryptocurrency space, it's a bit of a strange field, but one way to look at it is that there's all these people who are writing programs to let people make decisions in different ways. And whether it's making decisions about what to use for money or about how to rent computing time, all of these crypto networks are based on governance, that they make up some set of rules for how you can store files on somebody else's computer, or how you can pay someone, or how you can loan money. And then there's some method where everybody can vote in some way on how you change the rules. And that's what we need in HOA associations. I mean, if all the residents just had an app on their phone that asked them every week, like, how's the leader doing? Or like, which policies are most problematic to me? Like, man, I really want to be able to put my trash cans on the road. If we had that kind of feedback, I think it would be a lot harder to have that petty tyranny.
What about the idea, and I think it's kind of, you could take it either way here, but the idea of good fences make good neighbors. So the more, Rene Girard, who I pull his mimetic theory into some of my work, talks a lot about the idea that, conflict usually arises from sameness, not difference. It's keeping up with the Joneses that actually leads us into conflict. If we do return to a golden age, I don't want to use it as a mock, but if we did return to or discover, let's not say return, let's say go to something better, which is more local states like you're imagining, being in close proximity with those who would rule over those small bodies, would that not, that closer proximity, could that not breed more conflict? Because, for example, he talks about external mediators, those outside of our, ability to have any competition with. And those external mediators of desire, we tend to not have conflict with. Like, you can think of Cervantes' novel about the, Don Quixote, and his external mediator is the great literature that he's pulling from for the chivalry. So he's not in any conflict with those he's modeling. But if you have internal mediation, if the person who's ruling over your body is just down the road from you, would that proximity perhaps create more conflict, though,
Yeah.
internally? I
mean, I'm not saying that if we had more local power that everybody would just get along.
Right.
But I think that that local conflict is a lot less harmful than when conflict involves, I don't know, people who are in charge of nuclear weapons or trade sanctions or trillion-dollar bailouts. Mm-hmm. So, I think it's important to maybe separate some of these issues. And I don't know, I think there is another, like, okay, we compete with people who are most similar, but being close doesn't necessarily mean that you're in the same niche, right? There can be people in a community who are serving very different niches in terms of what their role in the community is, who don't feel like they're competing because they're physically close, because they're really different in what they do. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it's more, I mean, to me, this gets at some of the culture wars and the effect of the internet, where, as I see it, it's the connection of many people in broad areas that's led to so much Girardian conflict, because now you can, like, whoever it is in the world that's the most similar to you, like, you can follow their Twitter and read their blog. If you're really into staging, silly theatrical, like, if you like to go to a mall and suddenly, like, do a scene from Shakespeare and that's your thing, Like before, you had no one to compare yourself to because nobody else you knew was doing that. But with the internet, there's probably 10 other groups out there who go to malls and suddenly stage Shakespeare. And now you're going to be comparing yourself with all of them and bickering with them and trying to outdo them. So I think that thinking locally actually makes it easier because it's just a smaller group of people to sort yourself into niches. And that like global comparisons kind of bring more Girardian conflict because it's so easy to find and see and follow those people most similar to you.
Yeah, it's interesting, like that Animal Crossing game, they've talked about people having a lot of crisis and depression issues with the game now that you can share what you're doing online, because now, before
Yeah.
you could only compare it with your friends or whatever locally, but now they go on Twitter and they see these massive metropolises and all these rare items. And they say, oh my goodness, I've been playing this thing for days on end and I feel so inadequate, so pathetic. I can't keep up with the Joneses, and that's an example of that phenomenon. At the
Yeah,
same time,
absolutely.
we have Romulus and Remus, we have Cain and Abel, we have brothers that kill each other, and the idea of the ancient taboo about identical twins. Ancient communities, they would actually sacrifice identical twins because the sameness was a harbinger for potential runaway conflict, and so that was, and even in some remote villages today, they still do that. So
Yeah.
I'm just thinking it's like a tension there. I'm trying to help find some resolution or paradoxical balance that we can hold there, which is like,
Yeah.
yes, conflict can brew when because it is a state of undifferentiation. If you try to have
Right.
if you have 330 million people ruled by one city, that's a state of undifferentiation. There's no
Yeah.
boundaries, there's no fences, right? And that's why
Yeah.
people are fighting tooth and nail over who wins the presidency, because it's like, it's all or nothing. There's no
That's right.
50, it's just, and that's obviously not sustainable. I'm just interested in seeing, some of the ways that we can think this through in a way
Yeah.
that can build in protections for a brotherly conflict too. It's
Yeah.
interesting.
I mean, I don't know a great answer for resolving that tension, but I think one thing that we can do is, look, you can feed different parts of you, and there's that instinct for that Girardian instinct for conflict over sameness. But I think it's really important, especially in this coronavirus time, to focus on virtue ethics and on the idea of trying to be the best person that you can be, and that when we look at people, rather than comparing, we say, are they their best self? Are they trying to be their best self? Are they working out and eating well and treating their family well as best they can in this situation? And just nurturing the part of us that focuses on comparison with what we know we can do, comparison like with ourself and striving to be our ideal self, and just in our culture and in our friendships, just encourage that and discourage the kind of mimetic competition.
Right. Are you familiar with the work of Spencer Heath McCallum?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
used to read him a bit 20 years ago.
Yeah, the enterprise of community. I'm looking at a lot of the idea that you've talked about sounds familiar to his idea of creating kind of entrepreneurial communities, and this
Yeah.
sounds similar to kind of the vision of what you have in mind with these enterprise zones, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the idea of having a community that has kind of rules and institutions designed to make it a great place to live, and where the residents kind of share in that as well as the founder and operator of the community.
What would you say to folks that say, well, that's going back, that's a reactionary perspective, the idea of creating feudalism in a fancy suit? What would you say to folks that, because there's a lot of folks online that have a more egalitarian framework, and I'm not saying you don't, I'm just saying, what would you say to that general sentiment that a lot of young, especially younger generations may have that skepticism built into their way of processing the world, that the idea of an entrepreneur owning a small community and then providing kind of a terms of service, or what we would
Right.
say may perhaps the first social contract, that would be a real social contract,
Yeah.
right? um, how would you respond to that concern that this is reactionary, this is feudalism?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I very much come from the view that there's some parts of the past that are better, and there's some parts of the future that are the present that are better. Sometimes old things are good, and sometimes new things are good, and you have to actually look at them and analyze them to sort out the difference, and that kind of blanket favoring one or the other is just wrong. And the past is a really rich source of ideas for different ways to live together. And I think that there are some, in the areas of like of technology, like most areas of science and engineering technology and how to build things, how to build machines, things have just gotten better and better to where the past is completely useless. Where there's this idea of social technology, that ways of living together, that churches, that extended family groups, but there are these forms of social technology that we've gone backwards on, where we've been burning this cultural capital for various reasons. We've rebelled against them, and that's actually harming us, but we kind of don't notice, because our economic and technological ability is so much better. We don't notice that our governments do way worse, and our communities do way worse, and our families are broken, and yeah, people don't have communities. And so I would say, I think that there's a bunch of ways that we should be going backwards. It's just that we shouldn't blindly go backwards and assume that you can just reconstitute a past way of living without understanding why it went away or modifying it to the present age. You can't do that. But to me, the quest to restore those past social technologies in ways that work in the modern age, that's just incredibly valuable, and something our world and our country really needs. So it is, in some, like, going back to the city state, it is going backwards, right? But it's going backwards because we see that big countries just don't work, right? If you look at, to bring this back to coronavirus, one of the reasons why I think this is a great time for this idea of city states and private communities is that it's been made abundantly clear to the world how decayed some governments are, and how poorly the United States federal government, for example, how poorly it works. There's a bunch of us who've been saying for decades that it doesn't work very well. It's losing capacity. It can't handle new situations. And some other countries are much better. It's not just a government thing. It's differences in different places. And a lot of people didn't believe it. And now, May of 2020, you can no longer believe that the United States government works as well as Taiwan or Singapore or China, or Norway, at handling a crisis. Like it doesn't. And so we can see that different governments have very different capacities, and that it matters. Like the failures are destroying our economy. They're like leading to hundreds of thousands of people dying. Like these differences in quality of governance. So it's like, I'm sorry, you can't pretend that the way we do it is working. And if you actually look, like, what countries have done the best job, I would say it's either China, because they had a massive dictatorial state that was able to act tyrannically, and that worked. But we as Americans know the many downsides of that form of government, in our bones, we know. But then if you look at places like Taiwan or South Korea, they did it with a very targeted and limited degree of invasiveness, massive testing and, 14-day quarantines of people coming in, temperature testing. They did a bunch of these things, but, they worked, and they don't spy on all of their citizens or cut off their access to the internet the way China does. So like, I don't see how you can look at the world today and not say, hey, small countries work a lot better than big countries. Like it's just true. They get more of effectiveness plus, freedom. Like, I don't know a single large country that is effective and free. Like I only know China that's effective and totalitarian, and the US that's ineffective and free. So I think it's just hard to argue, if you look at the facts, that smaller isn't better. And look, some of the people who are into egalitarianism, or who might say these things, be worried about private communities, these are the same people who say, think locally, shop locally, eat locally. Like all we're doing is saying, hey, there's this other realm, the realm of governance, that's also done better locally for a lot of the same reasons. Because when you're close to what you're eating, when you're close to who's governing you, it's just less likely to go bad.
It's interesting because you mentioned technology, social technology, and I have a word that I use called gospel technology. I come from a church background. My father is a pastor, And so my background in that of telling the story, right? This story that grounds us and binds us together. The word religion, the Latin root for it means to bind together. What binds us together? And, one of the things that the Gospels reveal for those who experience it aesthetically and ethically, whether they get the meta claims or not. But I feel like we're swimming in a fishbowl of Judeo-Christianity because of our inheritance in the West. And we don't understand what it's doing to deconstruct the way we're trying to order our societies. And one of those things that it does is it reveals that culture is founded on a hidden victim, on the hidden sacrifice of one for the greater many. Caiaphas, before he kills Jesus, he says, before he leads the case to the political elites to kill Jesus, he says it's better that one man die than the whole nation perish. That's the founding sentence of all government. It's always based on, one group or one sect or one ethnic group or one class, or rich or poor. Somebody is going to take it. Someone's going to get bludgeoned. Someone's going to get banished and taken advantage of for the greater good to flourish. And the question for future governance is going to be, how can we build governance? How can we build a binding together effect of culture without that sacrificial root underneath it? That's the key issue. That's why we're going crazy in terms of, you hear this word all the time about a meaning crisis. We have a meaning crisis and a sense making. We don't have sense making. It's because nothing binds us together, and we're aware of our victimization faster than we're aware of our need to renounce violence. You see what I mean? We're aware of victims. Here's a victim, there's a victim, everywhere is a victim. But we cannot renounce the prerogative to use the imposition of coercion to correct those injustices that we see all around us. We always say, just a little bit more. I just need a little bit. I'm going to do this election and get this team in, and they'll do a little bit of force, and then we'll do the free stuff. We'll do the freedom stuff. But first, we got to punish our bad guys, punish the deep state, punish the right-wing Nazis, whoever it is that's your villain. You have to destroy them. Once the dragon's defeated, we'll talk about this free stuff, right? We'll talk about freedom and liberty. That seems to be the temptation that we have to overcome in society.
I mean, so I have a slightly different angle on this, and so maybe it doesn't resolve it, but another way to look at it is the idea of needing to have a common enemy. And there, I think this is something that we're getting from coronavirus, is that the answer, if it's deep in human nature that we need to band together against a common enemy, and often we band together against different ethnic groups or classes or countries, and that's no good. Well, the natural thing to me is let's band together against disease, against the parts of nature that are bad for humans. Let's band together against poverty, against starvation. Let's band together so that everybody can live to be, 120, then 180. To me, that's part of the answer. It's just getting people to see the enemy as, as let's band together to get on multiple planets. Let's band together to get on multiple solar systems so that if our star blows up, like, humanity survives. To me, that's part of the answer, but I see a weakness from what you're saying, in that it doesn't necessarily answer this, this desire to have a scapegoat, because, can nature be our scapegoat? I don't know if it works for humans. It can be an enemy that we band together to fight, but it's not something, I don't know that it's something that we can sacrifice. So maybe it's only a partial answer.
Well, that's why it's interesting, the old story of, if you got anger, go take it out on a pillow, punch a pillow. The pillow punching is not as satisfying as punching a Nazi, right? Or at least somebody else punching them on your behalf through politics, tax them, banish them, make their speech hate, illegal.
Blame. Blame only feels good if it goes onto another human or group of humans.
Right.
People hate blaming nature.
And that's the problem, because the West has this obsession with self-flagellation. We're the only culture that is completely obsessed with completely flagellating ourselves for past victories over other peoples.
Yeah.
Every other group, they still kind of keep that on the down low. Like, all right, we conquered does Japan talk about the indigenous groups that they've conquered? Do they flagellate about it, make it the primetime television series and education? Of course not, right? because their story isn't the same story that we've inherited in the West, which is
Right.
that, God desires mercy, not sacrifice. God makes the rain fall on the just as well as the unjust. Love your neighbor, not just love your neighbor, love your enemies too. These are stories that are, they're frying the old sacrificial order that all cultures have, but the ones that have been steeped in this anti-myth narrative of the Gospels, the ones that have been steeped in it the longest are the ones frying apart and becoming ineffective, because they can't keep once the cat's out of the bag, once we understand that that the institutions that we've believed in, for example, the 1619 Project, the New York Times, where they're basically saying that America, nothing was good about its founding. It was all a conspiracy to subject people into slavery. That was the entire purpose of the entire founding of the Republic. That's gospel infection, but it's an infection that's, you see what I mean? The gospel stories say Cain and Abel. The gospels say Romulus and Remus is your founding. And once you're aware of that, it ruins the glory of the nation. It ruins the binding together of the nation. And you're going to get these counter attempts at mythology saying, no, we're going to rewrite the mythology of America. It's all evil. Our ancestors were evil. But of course, even Jesus identified this in his life, because he says, you say that you wouldn't have persecuted the prophets like your ancestors, but you would,
Yeah.
And that's the fatal conceit of political correctness, is it's haunted by what I call gospel technology, which is a social technology allowing us to see the hidden victims of our institutions, but it doesn't want to renounce the violence. It says, no, we have to use the sacrificial violence of the state, and we got to get revenge. We have to get revenge in the way we do this. They can't renounce violence. And that inability to renounce violence, which is what the word repentance means, to turn your mind away from one way and move into a voluntary space of coexistence based on voluntary exchange of ideas and services and goods, like what you're talking about at the local level.
Yeah.
That's the place where we're having a problem moving towards in our culture.
Yeah. I guess I kind of wonder, with the things that you describe about the negative effects of gospel technologies, I wonder if it's a question of too much of a good thing, because I think that a lot of bad myths and bad views are just taking something too far, and that the idea of loving your neighbor as you love yourself, the willingness to look at your past sins and to repent, those are all really important qualities in a person, in a company, in a community, in a culture. But it's when you take them too far and begin to define yourself, not notice it, admit it, make amends, and then move on, but you somehow get trapped in it, that it's a problem. And I feel like we don't want to do away with that, entirely. It just needs to be balanced with self-love and with pride.
Well, with Jesus, he always makes it a free will choice that the person has to make. When you have the Good Samaritan, he says, it's the radical choice of seeing your enemy, seeing the neo-Nazi, or if you're a right wing, seeing the deep state people who are destroying America, right? You see them lying on the ground, suffering in a state of vulnerability, and there's no edict from on high that's legislated your ability to do something. Rather, it's a radical choice you have to make to determine, should I help this person? This is an enemy of mine. This is someone who thinks of me, the Samaritan would be seen as less than an animal to the person that's lying and suffering in the story he tells. But it's that choice where you say, I'm going to sacrifice my right to myself and my comfort rather than allow my neighbor, and in this case, my enemy, to be sacrificed to the ravages of this attack that has happened to them. And so it's that moment of free will choice where you say, if this could be an attack, this could be a setup. There could be robbers waiting to bait me to go tend to this man and kill me. Or perhaps this will shame me out of my town and I'll be in destitution once word gets out that I helped an enemy that hates our guts. And it's all those choices that they have to calculate and say, no, I will go and save my neighbor. I will go and help my enemy, in fact. And that's what Jesus says is the key to living an abundant life and to inherit the kingdom of heaven on earth. So how would that look like today? You know, it means that you're right. You're exactly right. In fact, Girard would call political correctness, and he did call political correctness, super Christianity or totalitarian Christianity, because it attempts to use the love of your neighbor and the self-reflection of the things you've done, but it wants to radicalize it into a violent system, in which you say, no, we will force you to hire who we tell you to hire, and we will force you to spend your money on the things that we as a collective, because we have the might makes right, we have the numbers on our side, we'll force you to do these things that we want you to do, and we'll force you to do the kind of medicine we want you to do, and we will force you to help that neighbor, and we're going to force you to love them as you're supposed to love yourself.
And that's not love.
Right.
There is no love when you're forced.
So that's the combination that we have to keep in mind, because the right, sometimes in some libertarian circles, they're really obsessed with freedom, freedom, freedom. Don't judge any. It's like, no, it's freedom plus virtue.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Freedom plus self-sacrifice. You have to self-sacrifice the ego. And that's where a lot of libertarian conversations end. They're like, no. Don't give any normative statements. We're only talking about what not to do, which is don't use force. But that's not the whole story, is it?
No, that's their focus, and it's an important focus. But without virtue, it's just crap. It can become selfishness. You know, if you're just like, I want the freedom to do whatever. It's like, if freedom is a container in which you build a good life, and the bigger the container, the less constrained you are, the better a life you can build if you set yourself to it. You know, that's the way to go. And if you just want the container, and then within the container you're wild, or you don't help other people, that you don't seek virtue, then that's just a failure.
Yeah, it's like there's something built into the system of our culture that we abuse our freedom, we use our liberty as a license to be awful to each other, and then it creates this blowback in the population that clamors for government control to fix the injustice that happened in the free space. You know, for example, mistreatment of women in the workplace, right? That you people have this ability to hire who they want, but all of a sudden they're discriminating. But then, so they're abusing the freedom of property relationships, right?
Right.
But then that foments into a victim garbed cry to the state to say, please save us from these abusers of liberty.
Yeah.
And so the state comes in and says, boom, this is our one size fits all policy. We're going to control private contract, who you can hire. We're going to set regulations up. We're going to stifle the freedom. We're going to take it away from you, because when you had that freedom, you didn't know what to do with it. You made a fool of yourselves, and now we're going to fix you. We're going to heal you from your bigotry. So it's a messianic state.
Control, right? Not like heal you by teaching you virtue, by helping you get along, by showing you that these other people that you're discriminating against are as capable and as competent. You know, it's not by reminding you to love your neighbor as yourself. And so they're trying to control.
And they push it underground. They push the hate and bigotry underground, and it foments and grows, because, again, the fascinating thing about being in a Christ or gospel haunted culture is that whenever you exclude something, it gains power.
Yeah.
Because it's all in the imitation of this aesthetic of the crucified one cast out of the city is the one that everybody looks to as that's the place of ultimate goodness, right? So for example, YouTube and all these places that are socially deleting alt-right or far-right, that gains them power precisely because we're a Christ-haunted society whose imagination is shaped by the idea of the ultimate good being found in the one who's excluded, left to die outside the camp, including bad, unsavory ideas. They gain currency by their expulsion, by their so-called social crucifixion. It gives them power. So, like, whatever we do, we can't get out of this bubble we're in. We can't get out of this fish tank of this cruciform form of storytelling. You see what I mean?
The Streisand effect. The Streisand effect, which is, for those who don't know, it's the idea that a long time ago in the early days of the internet, Barbara Streisand tried to get some things about her taken down. And because she was trying to censor them, they got amplified. Way more people paid attention to them and shared them, exactly because she tried to sacrifice this information. And it's the idea that when you forbid or ban or exclude something, it actually gets it more of an audience.
That wasn't the way it was in the old world. In the old world, there was a priestly caste. They wrote the mythology, and Oedipus to this day is guilty of patricide and incest and patricide, right?
Yeah.
So the history is written by the winners. There is no counter story. But today, because of the infection of Judeo-Christian storytelling, which is exposing the same events of the scapegoat mechanism, but now doing it from the vantage point of the victim, now that has this spiraling effect that unwinds and unbounds all cultural order and sense making, because every time you expunge or villainize some group or idea as a monster, it gives it power. It gives it cruciform power. It gives, and so everybody now, in order to gain power in the West, you have to preen to be on a martyr's perch. You have to covet the cross of Christ, to say, I'm on the cross the most. I have the most victim markers. And it's so, look at me and my suffering, or look at me and my alliance with those who suffer the most. And that allows me to have power over you, right? But the one thing we don't want to do, like you were saying, is it's that free will choice. We don't want to allow that. We don't want to allow these things to be worked out non-violently, do we?
Yeah. There's almost a cargo cult, or like an imitating the form over the substance of the idea that, like, to be Jesus-like, instead of emulating the many virtues of Jesus, you just got to get crucified, right? And like, what could be more backward than like, oh, how do I be holy? I explain how I'm a victim and how the masses are against me, as opposed to you get holy by dedicating yourself to living an incredible life, like a life full of love.
Right. That's what Peter's trying. Yeah, that's the story that Peter, his apostle, is dealing with when he says he's going to die on the cross. And he says, no, we're not going to let you die and suffer on the cross. That would be totally awful. You're not doing that. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, which means accuser. He's like, it's like saying, get behind me, special prosecutor. You're accusing me of doing the things that you want to do, which is, you see that the people are suffering. You see the crowds of the disabled and the handicapped and the poor and the destitute that are coming to my sermons in the Galilee, and you want to bottle this up and turn this into a political program. You want me to sit on the throne. But if you do that, you're not going to understand anything about the order of the world that I'm trying to unleash. You're going to miss the entire point. The entire point of what I'm going to do is inaugurate a new world order in history, in which that way of imposing good ideas through the shortcut of force will no longer work. And the more you attempt it, the longer this story grows. The longer this story steeps in a culture, the more you attempt it, the more it backfires and creates chaos.
And that is our world.
That's where we're at. Well, I want to ask you one question, and I think it ties kind of where we're going, but I think someone as a venture capitalist, we can close out with this, which is, how do we overcome this notion that to be for capital, or let's say to be for freedom, means that you are for profit motive as your primary concern? I've seen this criticism on both the left and the right from those of us who still advocate for market order, market to take care of problems. So, for example, one thing that I've been pushing a lot is to do clinical trials for, I've had a guy on my program named Professor Michael Lasanti. He's of Salford University in Manchester. He's an American professor. He's the chair of translational medicine in Salford. And he's got over 90,000 citations, over 362 papers he's published in his life. He's one of the most cited scholars on Google Scholar, dead or alive.
Wow.
Freud is up there in the top 5. But the thing that I find interesting is that, what he has proposed is that we could take ordinary FDA-approved drugs, antibiotics that are generic now, like azithromycin, which has been in the news because of its association as a backup to the hydroxychloroquine thing that Trump and some others were pushing. And he says, if you use azithromycin and or another FDA-approved generic antibiotic called doxycycline, which is the most prescribed drug in America, that he believes that they could act as a prophylactic or even a treatment for coronavirus. And he has published a paper in the British Medical Journal calling for NHS workers to take azithromycin or doxycycline as a prophylactic to prevent the coronavirus. Now, the question that I have is, it seems to be so hard to advance the notion that markets can solve problems like a pandemic without requiring some kind of massive profit margin. You know, all the drugs that get a lot of the good media press are drugs that are still patented.
Yeah.
You know, they've got a lot of profit margin forever is going to push them. And all the drugs that could come down the road, new vaccines, will be patented. But in my opinion, you know, I look at a market and I say, well, and I know there's debate about intellectual property, and I know we have to work with the system we have, but when I look at azithromycin and doxycycline, they're off patent. So they're as close to a market product as we could get. You know, they're generic, meaning anybody could manufacture, and anybody technically could go through the FDA trials, double-blind studies to show that these things can work as coronavirus. And yet we're told that no, only market solutions are only concerned with massive profit margins. But you're not going to make a lot of profit margin off of making the case that a generic antibiotic that costs a few cents to manufacture and it sells for a few bucks, like azithromycin, you're not going to make a lot of profit margin off of that. But for some reason, people think that market means obscene profit margin. But markets don't have to mean that, do they?
No, they don't. And, you know, I think it's important to think of markets as a tool and as one of our like broadest and most applicable and most powerful tools, you know, but still limited. And I would say for something like these generic drugs, that looking at open source software and things like Wikipedia and kind of crowdsourced knowledge is much better. So, you know, when something has a lot of value that's not going to be captured by any one company, as with an off-patent drug, you know, that I think the solution is people coming together and supplying studies and doing their own experiments and figuring out how to manufacture it. You know, I mean, we have a world full of things that are made by people, you know, and not by big companies. I mean, look at what's happening with masks when the evidence accumulated that masks were really important for preventing coronavirus spread, but they didn't have to be these N95 masks, anything that stops your coughs from getting out and infecting other people. And so we've got all of these designs for masks that you can just download, and people are, you know, sitting in their living room and like sewing masks for their neighborhood. I think we have great mechanisms and social technologies for addressing things that are in that niche of, you know, it's not super profitable. But I would say I disagree with you about the idea that azithromycin and generic drugs are in the market, because you still have to get FDA approval. Like, you have to get a doctor to prescribe them. You have to get FDA approval of your manufacturing facility. So, you know, even if they could in theory be a few cents, there's these huge barriers such that we can't just distribute antibiotics the way that we distribute masks.
But what frustrates me about it all, you're right, it's not a true free market even in that, but still, it is a cartel. But what bugs me is, you know, I've had Lasanti on an interview, and he makes a very simple case, because he's used azithromycin and doxycycline in his lab to show that it kills senescent cells. The azithromycin, 97% of the senescent cells were killed in the lab culture. And then he started using azithromycin and doxycycline for cancer stem cells in human patients, breast cancer patients. And he found that a small dosage, lower, like 200 milligrams or less, was able to eliminate cancer stem cells in a dramatic degree. Cancer stem cells are the key to metastasis. Cancer stem cells are also connected to senescent cells, right? So then I remember talking to him, I said, you know, so you have this coronavirus is killing people who are elderly, which means they have a prevalence of senescent cells.
Yeah.
And Lasanti's hypothesis that he published in Aging, the journal Aging, basically says, well, azithromycin has demonstrated it has the ability to kill senescent markers like CD26 and ACE2, which are the key host receptors that have been identified to a coronavirus becoming a lethal problem. It also has, azithromycin has been demonstrated to be a protein synthesis inhibitor, which is the key to stopping viral replication.
Mm-hmm.
It also has the ability to inhibit collagen synthesis, which is the key to stopping the fibrosis of the lungs. It's collagen that creates that fibrotic tissue, which ends up killing the patient with the lungs issue. So it's been demonstrated to have antiviral properties for other viruses like Ebola and so forth. But here's the big problem. If you look at media, the media villainizes azithromycin, partly because Trump tweeted it out as a something that's a side thing that you should take with hydroxychloroquine, but also because I think it's a generic drug and the media makes too much money from patented drugs.
There's no one to defend it.
So what can you do? What do you do in that situation when you know that clinical trials need to be done, but we have a cartel?
You burn down the media and you build a replacement.
Yeah.
You listen to the people who were warning about coronavirus in January or February, and you don't listen to the people who the media sources that were saying, this is nothing, this is bogus, it's just the flu, don't wear masks. I mean, through very late, a lot of sources were saying, including some official sources, like, don't wear masks. Like, this is why, we can see, in the same way that we can see that some of our governments don't work very well in the world from this crisis, we can also see just how inaccurate so many of our media institutions are. And like, sure, there's downsides to crowdsourced information and, to getting your info from unofficial channels. I mean, the unofficial channels, I think, are more likely to be right when the mainstream is wrong, but they're also more likely to be like, they're very wrong sometimes. And so it's important to look at both of them with a healthy dose of skepticism and combine them. But, you cannot trust the mainstream media to be giving you accurate facts because they are subject to profit margins and to incentives. And like you said, if they're looking to bash Trump and they're looking to boost the prescription, the patented drugs that they can get revenue from somehow that advertise, for example, then they're just going to give you really crappy information about any generic drugs that Trump has tweeted, and you should evaluate the medical evidence, and not listen to these stupid journalists.
So how do we do clinical trials, though, when the market is captured by this cartel incentive structure that the FDA has set up? Because all the money people who could be doing stuff, they're all funneling their money into the standard FDA approval process. Let's go look for a patentable drug. And they're like, you're like azithromycin. What are you talking about? That surely could not be the solution to here.
Maybe we should be doing civil disobedience. Maybe in the same way that Elon Musk has said, I'm going to go reopen our factory in Alameda, and if the government wants to arrest anyone for violating the lockdown, they should arrest me. Maybe we should be doing azithromycin, voluntary azithromycin studies, just using quantified self communities and tracking apps. Let's test it ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. And who cares about what the FDA says? Let's test it ourselves. Let's use it ourselves. In the future, we're going to be able to manufacture it ourselves with chem printers, bypass them completely. Or the countries that are more sensible, that are not so tied to patent monopolies, maybe you can convince those countries. I mean, there's, hydroxychloroquine is used heavily in Africa because it's cheap and it works against malaria, and it's just much more studied there. Like, not every country has the screwed up incentives of the United States. So sometimes you should think locally, but sometimes you should think globally too, and just say, all right, what countries will be willing to do these trials because they care about what works and not where the money is? Or act locally, just test it anyway.
Yeah. Very good. I think we have a bias towards complex solutions. It's got to be a new drug that's so expensive. It's going to take $2 billion to go through the trials. And it's going to take, we don't want to believe it's something right under our noses. Like, are you kidding me? There's an arrogance that we have built into our search for scientific solutions.
Yeah. Masks is a great example of that. I mean, there was a lot of misinformation out there, and also it just seems too simple. Mm-hmm. Like, does this really reduce transmission that much? Well, it turns out, yes, it does, but people resisted it because the idea that sticking a bandana on your face might help save your country, it just seems ridiculous.
Patri Friedman, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Great discussion.
All right, thanks for having me, David.
Thank you.